He didn't raise his voice, and somehow that made it worse. The rain hit the pavement like a warning I didn't understand yet. Each drop sharp against the neon reflections outside the restaurant window. And I remember thinking if I just kept moving, just kept smiling, maybe tonight would pass like every other night. Quiet, forgettable, survivable. But my hands were shaking again, and no amount of foundation could fully hide the faint bruising circling my wrist. So I adjusted my sleeve for the third time in 10 minutes and forced myself to breathe like nothing was wrong, like I wasn't counting every second until my shift ended, like I wasn't afraid of what waited outside. The dinner rush had just started when he walked in, and everything shifted without anyone saying a word. Conversations softened, eyes lowered. Even the manager straightened his tie like he suddenly remembered how small he was in a room like this. And I didn't need an introduction to know that man carried something heavier than money, something colder, something that made people move out of his way before he even asked. He didn't look at the menu when he sat down, didn't glance at the wine list, didn't acknowledge the other men at his table beyond a single nod. His attention moved once, slowly, deliberately, until it landed on me, and I felt it before I understood it, like a spotlight cutting through everything I'd tried to hide. I told myself it didn't matter, that he was just another wealthy customer, just another man with expensive taste and expensive silence. So I picked up the water pitcher and walked toward his table like I had done 100 times before. Steady steps, practice smile, eyes down just enough to stay polite without inviting anything more. But when I reached his side, something in the air felt different, heavier, like the room had narrowed down to a single point, and I was standing right in it. "Water?" I asked, my voice softer than usual, and he nodded once, slow, controlled, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the glass as I poured. And that's when it happened. The smallest thing, the kind of mistake no one should notice. My sleeve slipped back an inch. Just enough, just long enough for the mark to show, faint purple beneath my skin, and his gaze dropped instantly, precise, unhurried, like he had been waiting for proof of something he already suspected. I pulled my arm back too quickly, nearly knocking the glass, my heart jumping into my throat. But his hand moved faster, steadying the base before it tipped, his touch firm but careful, nothing like the grip I was used to, nothing that hurt. And that difference hit me harder than anything else, the control in it, the choice not to hurt. "Careful," he said, his voice low, even, not a warning, not a command, just a statement that somehow carried more weight than either. And I nodded quickly, stepping back, forcing my hands to stop trembling as I finished the table and moved away. But I could still feel his eyes on me, tracking every movement, noticing things no one else ever did. The way I flinched when a plate dropped in the kitchen. The way I kept my left side angled away from everyone. The way I kept adjusting that sleeve. Like it could erase something that had already happened. I told myself I was imagining it. That men like him didn't notice girls like me, didn't care, didn't get involved. But 20 minutes later, when I passed his table again, he spoke, and the room seemed to quiet just enough for me to hear it clearly. "Who did that to you?" The question was simple, direct, and it stopped me in place, my mind scrambling for the same lie I always used, the same safe answer that kept everything contained. "It was nothing," I said quickly, not meeting his eyes. I bumped into a door, and I could feel the silence stretch between us, heavy, deliberate, like he was measuring the truth of it without needing another word. And when I finally looked up, his expression hadn't changed, still calm, still unreadable, but something behind his eyes had shifted, something colder, sharper, like a decision had already been made. He didn't argue, didn't press, didn't expose the lie. He just gave a small nod and turned his attention back to the table like the conversation was over, like it meant nothing. But as I walked away, my pulse racing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already started, something I didn't understand yet, something quiet and dangerous and inevitable. And for the first time in months, I wasn't just afraid of the man waiting for me outside. I was afraid of the man who had just noticed. I should have left when my shift ended, but the rain had turned heavier, thick sheets slamming against the pavement like the night was trying to trap everything in place, and I stood under the narrow awning outside the restaurant, arms wrapped around myself, pretending I was just waiting for a ride instead of delaying the moment I had to walk into whatever version of him was waiting tonight. Because with Tyler it was never predictable, never consistent, just a quiet tension that could snap. without warning, and my phone buzzed in my pocket again, his name lighting up the screen like a threat I could not ignore. So I silenced it and told myself I just needed 5 more minutes, just enough time for the street to clear, just enough time to gather the courage I was losing with every second. The door behind me opened softly, and I felt it before I saw him, that same shift in the air, controlled, deliberate, like the world adjusted itself around his presence. And when I turned, he was there, standing just inside the light, coat dark against the rain, expression unreadable, as if he had been watching longer than I realized. "You are still here," he said, not as a question, just an observation, and I forced a small smile that felt fragile at the edges, waiting for my ride. I answered, even though we both knew it was not true, and something in his gaze lingered on me for a second longer than necessary, like he was deciding whether to say more, whether to push past the line I had drawn without words. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough that his voice did not have to rise over the storm. "You should not wait alone," he said quietly, and there was no force in it, no command, just a calm certainty that made it harder to refuse, but I shook my head anyway. "I will be fine," I insisted, because that was what I always said, what I had trained myself to believe, even when it was not true. His eyes did not leave mine, and for a moment, I thought he might argue, might press, but instead he gave a small nod, like he had already expected the answer, like he understood something about me I had never explained, and he stepped back, the distance returning between us, but not the feeling of being watched, not the awareness that he had not actually let it go. The sound of tires cutting through water broke the moment, a car pulling up too fast at the curb, headlights too bright, too familiar, and my chest tightened before I even saw the door open, before I heard my name called in that tone that always carried something sharp underneath it. "Hannah," Tyler said, stepping out into the rain like it did not touch him, like nothing ever did, his eyes already scanning me, already looking for something to question, something to control, and I felt myself shrink instinctively, my shoulders pulling in, my breath shortening, every instinct telling me to keep things calm, keep things quiet, keep things from escalating into something worse. "I was calling you," he continued, his voice low but tight, and I forced a steady tone. My phone was on silent. I was finishing my shift, and I could feel the lies sitting between us, thin and fragile, but necessary, always necessary. He moved closer, too close, his presence filling the small space under the awning, and his hand reached for my arm, fingers closing around my wrist in a grip that was not painful, not yet, but firm enough to remind me exactly who he thought I belonged to, and I flinched before I could stop myself. The reaction small, but visible, and in that instant, everything seemed to pause. I did not need to look to know the other man was still there, that he had seen it, understood it, because the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like something had shifted in a way that could not be undone. Tyler noticed the movement too, his eyes narrowing slightly, his grip tightening just enough to make a point. "You okay?" he asked, but it was not concern, it was a test, and I nodded quickly. "I am fine," I said, the words automatic, practiced, and empty. Another second passed, then another, and then Tyler released my arm. The tension easing just enough for him to step back, his attention already moving elsewhere, his focus shifting like the moment had not mattered, like it had not been seen. But I knew better, because when I finally glanced toward the doorway again, he was still there, still watching, and this time there was no question in his expression, no uncertainty, just a quiet, controlled understanding that made my stomach drop, like something had just been confirmed. He did not move toward us, did not intervene, did not speak, but as Tyler opened the car door and gestured for me to get in, I felt it, that invisible line being drawn somewhere behind me, something silent and absolute, and for the first time, I realized that whatever happened next was no longer entirely in my control. The car door closed with a dull, final sound that seemed louder than it should have been, sealing me into the quiet tension that always followed, and I kept my eyes forward as Tyler pulled away from the curb, the rain streaking across the windshield in uneven lines that blurred the city into something distant and unreachable, like I was already somewhere else, somewhere I could not get back from. And I folded my hands in my lap to stop them from shaking, focusing on the rhythm of the wipers. Left, right, right, anything to anchor myself to something predictable. "Who was that?" he asked after a minute, his voice casual in a way that never meant anything good. And I swallowed before answering, keeping my tone steady. "Just a customer," I said, because that was safe, because that was simple, and because anything more would turn into something I could not control. But I felt his eyes flick toward me, sharp, measuring, searching for the part of the story I was not saying. "He did not look like just anyone," Tyler continued, one hand tightening slightly on the steering wheel, and I forced a small shrug, like it did not matter, like none of it mattered. "He is just someone who comes in sometimes," I said, and the silence that followed stretched longer this time, heavier, like the air itself was waiting for him to decide what to do with that answer. He exhaled slowly, the tension easing just enough that I knew I had said the right thing, at least for now, and the rest of the drive passed without another question. But that did not make it easier, because with him, quiet never meant calm, it just meant delayed. When we reached the apartment, the rain had softened into a steady drizzle, the kind that lingered without end, and I stepped out of the car quickly, moving toward the building before he could say anything else, before he could pull me back into whatever mood he had been building in his head. But I heard his door shut behind me, footsteps closing the distance, always just close enough to remind me he was there. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cleaning solution and old carpet, the overhead light flickering once before settling, and I reached for my keys with steady hands, unlocking the door like it was any other night, like I had not felt something shift earlier that I could not explain, like I had not seen the way another man had watched and understood without needing to ask. Tyler moved past me once we were inside, setting his keys on the counter with a sharp click, and I busied myself with routine, setting my bag down, moving toward the kitchen, anything to keep the moment from turning into something else, something heavier. But I could feel it building anyway, that familiar pressure in the air that meant he was thinking, replaying, questioning. "You have been distant lately," he said finally, his voice low, controlled, and I paused just long enough to respond without hesitation. "I have been working a lot," I said, which was true, even if it was not the whole truth, and he watched me for a second longer before nodding, like he was accepting it, like the conversation could end there, and for a moment, I thought maybe it would. But then he stepped closer, not enough to trap me, just enough to remind me how easily he could, his presence filling the small space between us, and his hand reached for mine again, fingers wrapping around my wrist in that same firm hold. And this time I did not pull away, did not flinch, because I had learned what that did, how it shifted things in ways that were harder to manage. "You know I worry about you," he said, his tone softer now, almost convincing, and I nodded, because that was what he needed to hear, what kept things steady, what kept everything from tipping into something worse. "I know," I answered quietly, and for a second, the moment held, balanced on something fragile and uncertain. Then he let go, stepping back, the tension easing just enough for me to breathe again, and I turned toward the sink, gripping the edge of the counter as the weight of the night settled in, heavier than before, because now there was something else layered into it, something new, something I could not ignore. I could still see it, the way that man had looked at me, the way he had not needed an explanation to understand what was happening, and the way he had said nothing, done nothing, but somehow made it feel like everything had already changed. I told myself it did not matter, that men like him did not step into lives like mine, did not get involved, did not cross that line without a reason. But as I stood there, staring at the rain tracing slow lines down the window, I could not shake the feeling that a reason had already been found, and somewhere out there, beyond the walls of this apartment, beyond the quiet routine I had built to survive, something was already moving, silent and deliberate, and it was not going to stop. I did not sleep that night. Not really, just drifted in and out of something shallow and restless, every sound pulling me back to the surface, every shift in the apartment making my chest tighten like I was waiting for something I could not name. And when morning finally came, pale light pushing through the thin curtains, I felt more exhausted than before, like the night had taken something from me instead of giving anything back. Tyler had already left by the time I stepped into the kitchen, his coffee mug sitting in the sink, half empty, a silent reminder of the routine I had learned to navigate, and I moved through my own motions automatically, tying my hair back, pulling on my uniform, adjusting my sleeve carefully over my wrist like it was armor I could not afford to lose. The rain had stopped, but the air still felt heavy when I stepped outside. Damp pavement reflecting the early traffic, the city already moving like nothing had happened, like nights like mine did not exist in the daylight. And I told myself today would be normal, that I would go to work, finish my shift, come home, and nothing else would change, because that was how I survived, by keeping everything contained, predictable, controlled. But the moment I walked into the restaurant, I knew something was off, not obvious, not loud, just a subtle shift in the way people moved, the way my manager avoided my eyes for half a second too long, the way one of the kitchen staff glanced at me and then quickly looked away, like there was something I had missed, something already in motion that I had not been told about. "You are early," Maria said as she passed me near the counter. Her voice normal, but her expression slightly tighter than usual, and I nodded, forcing a small smile. Could not sleep, I admitted, which was true, and she hesitated for a fraction of a second before leaning closer, lowering her voice just enough that no one else would hear. "Be careful today," she said quietly, and that was all. No explanation, no context, just a warning that settled in my chest like a weight I could not shake. I wanted to ask what she meant, wanted to press for something more, but she had already moved away, disappearing into the rhythm of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with a question that felt heavier than it should have been. The shift started like any other. Orders, trays, the steady hum of conversation, but I could not relax into it. Not fully, because every few minutes I felt it again, that sense of being watched, not in the obvious way, not like last night, but something quieter, more distant, like eyes I could not see were still there, still tracking, still waiting. I told myself I was imagining it, that I was letting one moment stretch into something bigger than it was, but then the door opened, and everything stilled just enough for me to notice. He walked in the same way he had before, controlled, unhurried, like time adjusted itself to match his pace, and the room responded without thinking, conversations lowering, movements slowing. That same invisible shift that made it clear he did not belong to this place. He owned the space around him without ever asking for it. I felt my breath catch before I could stop it, my hands tightening slightly around the tray I was holding, because I knew this was not random, not coincidence, not something I could ignore, and when his gaze lifted and found me again, it was immediate, precise, like he had expected me to be there, like he had come back for a reason. I forced myself to move, to continue working, to pretend nothing was different, but every step felt heavier, every second stretched thinner, and when I approached his table, placing the glass down with careful hands, I could feel the silence settle between us before he even spoke. "You made it home," he said, his voice low, calm, not a question, not quite a statement either, and I hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding. "Yes," I answered, my voice quieter than I intended, and something in his expression shifted, subtle but undeniable, like he had been waiting for that confirmation, like it mattered more than it should have. He studied me for a moment longer, his eyes moving once, briefly, to my wrist, where the sleeve still hid what it was meant to hide, and then back to my face, steady, controlled, and I felt that same tension build again, that sense that something was about to happen, something I was not ready for. "Good," he said finally, and there was something in the way he said it, something final, something resolved, like a decision had been completed somewhere beyond this conversation, beyond this room, and I did not know why, but the words settled deep in my chest, heavier than anything else he could have said. I nodded again, stepping back, continuing my shift like I was supposed to, like everything was still normal, but as I moved through the restaurant, through the noise and the routine and the familiar patterns, I could not ignore it anymore. That feeling that something had already shifted, that a line had been crossed without my permission, and whatever came next was no longer something I could avoid, no matter how carefully I tried to stay out of it. By the time the dinner rush peaked, I had memorized every movement in the room just to keep from thinking about him. But it did not work, because awareness is not something you can turn off once it has been switched on, and I felt it every time I stepped within 10 feet of his table, that quiet gravity pulling my focus whether I wanted it or not. And worse, he did not look away, not even once, not even when others spoke to him, like I was part of the equation now, something already included in whatever calculation he had made. I kept my distance as much as I could, rotating sections, offering to cover for other servers, anything to avoid being pulled back into that stillness around him. But avoidance only works until it does not. And halfway through the shift, my manager called my name from across the room, too loudly, too deliberately, and I knew before I even turned what was coming. "Hannah, table 12, he said, not meeting my eyes, and I forced myself to nod, picking up the tray with steady hands that did not feel steady at all, because there was no way around it now, no excuse, no detour, just a straight line back to the one place I had been trying to avoid all night. The walk felt longer than it should have, each step measured, controlled, like I was trying to keep something inside me from spilling over, and when I reached the table, he was already watching me, not surprised, not curious, just expectant, like he had known this would happen, like he had waited for it. I set the plates down carefully, one by one, focusing on the details, the placement, the balance, anything except his eyes, but that did not stop me from feeling them, steady and unrelenting, until finally I had no choice but to meet them. "You are distracted," he said, his voice low enough that only I could hear, and I shook my head quickly. "No, just busy," I answered, but even as I said it, I knew it sounded thin, like something that would not hold under pressure, and his gaze did not soften, did not shift, just stayed fixed on me like he was waiting for something real. "Busy does not make your hands shake," he replied calmly, and that was when I realized he had noticed more than I thought, more than anyone ever did, and something inside me tightened in response, instinctive, defensive, like I needed to protect whatever was left of my control. "I am fine," I said again, more firmly this time, because repetition had always been my shield, the one thing that kept questions from going further. But he did not interrupt, did not argue, just studied me for another second before leaning back slightly in his chair, creating space without removing the weight of his presence. "You are not," he said quietly, and the certainty in his tone hit harder than if he had raised his voice, because there was no doubt in it, no hesitation, just a statement of fact I could not deny without lying outright. And for a moment, I considered it, considered repeating the same line again, forcing the conversation to end the way it always did, but something stopped me, something unfamiliar and fragile that made it harder to pretend. I looked away first, breaking the moment before it could become something else, something deeper, and I stepped back from the table, ready to leave, ready to put distance between us again, but his voice followed, just enough to hold me in place without calling attention. "Does he always pick you up?" he asked, and the question froze me mid-step, because it was too specific, too precise, and I felt the air shift again, that same awareness settling heavier in my chest. I turned slowly, meeting his gaze, and for the first time, there was no room to pretend I did not understand what he meant. "That is not your concern," I said quietly, the words coming out steadier than I felt, because boundaries were all I had left, the only thing that kept my life from unraveling completely, and for a second, the room seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see how he would respond. He did not react the way I expected, did not push, did not challenge, just watched me with that same calm intensity before nodding once, like he accepted the line I had drawn, even if he had no intention of respecting it. "It is now," he said simply, and something in the way he said it made my stomach drop, because it was not a threat, not a promise, just a quiet declaration that felt more permanent than either. And I realized then that whatever I thought I could keep separate, whatever I believed I could control, was already slipping out of my hands, because he had already decided, and men like him did not change their minds once they made one. The rest of my shift blurred into something mechanical, orders and movements stitched together by habit rather than thought, because every part of me was still caught on those two words, "It is now," repeating in a quiet loop I could not shut off, and no matter how many tables I served, no matter how many times I told myself to focus, I could feel it lingering, that shift in control I had not agreed to but could not undo. I avoided his table after that, not obviously, not in a way anyone else would question, but carefully, deliberately, passing responsibility to other servers when I could, keeping my distance when I could not, and he did not call me back, did not demand attention, which somehow made it worse, because it meant he did not need to, meant whatever he had decided did not rely on my presence to continue. By the time my shift ended, the city had settled into that late-hour quiet, the kind that made every sound feel sharper, every movement more noticeable, and I stood in the back hallway longer than necessary, tying and readying the string of my apron just to delay stepping outside again, just to delay facing whatever version of the night was waiting for me. Maria caught my arm lightly as she passed, her expression more serious now, less subtle than before. "Do not wait alone tonight," she said under her breath, and I forced a small nod, even though I knew how this would go, how it always went, predictable in ways that made it harder to change. When I finally stepped out, the air had turned colder, the earlier rain replaced by a damp chill that settled into everything, and the street was quieter than usual, fewer cars, fewer people, just enough space to make me feel exposed in a way I could not ignore. I checked my phone out of habit, no messages, no missed calls, and for a second, that absence felt heavier than anything else, because silence from Tyler never meant peace. It meant something building, something waiting. I started walking anyway, keeping close to the edge of the sidewalk, my steps quick but controlled, telling myself I would just make it to the corner, just reach the main street where there were more lights, more people, more noise, anything to make the world feel less narrow. I had just reached the end of the block when I heard the engine, low at first, then closer, too familiar, and my shoulders tensed before I even turned, before I saw the car slowing beside me, the window lowering just enough for his voice to cut through the quiet. "Get in," Tyler said, not loudly, not aggressively, just that same controlled tone that left no room for refusal, and I stopped, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just holding still like if I did not move, I could somehow delay what came next. "I can walk," I said, my voice steadier than I felt, and for a second, there was only silence, the kind that stretches thin before it snaps. And then he exhaled sharply, his hand tightening on the steering wheel. "Hannah," he said, my name carrying a warning I knew too well, and I felt that familiar pull, that instinct to keep things calm, to avoid escalation, to make the choice that ended the moment faster, even if it cost me something later. I stepped toward the car, reaching for the handle, because that was what I always did, chose the easier path in the moment, the one that kept everything from tipping too far. But before my hand could close around it, another car pulled up behind us, silent, smooth, close enough to shift the air in a way I felt immediately. Tyler glanced in the rearview mirror, irritation flickering across his expression, and I turned slightly, just enough to see the dark vehicle behind us, headlights steady, engine quiet, and something in my chest tightened, not fear this time, something else, something sharper, more uncertain. The driver's side door opened slowly, deliberately, and he stepped out like he had nowhere else to be, like time itself waited for him to move first, and the distance between us suddenly felt smaller than it was, charged with something I could not name. He did not look at me right away, his attention settling on Tyler with calm precision, and for a moment, no one spoke, the street holding its breath around us. I felt it then, that same shift from before, only stronger now, more defined. Like the line I had sensed earlier was no longer invisible, no longer distant, but right here, right now, drawn clearly between two men who understood something I was only beginning to realize. And for the first time, I was not standing outside of it anymore. I was at the center of it. No one spoke at first, and that silence stretched tighter than any argument ever could, the kind that made every small movement feel amplified, every breath feel like a decision. And I stood there with my hand still hovering near the car door, caught between two versions of my life that had never been meant to collide. Not like this. Not out in the open where I could not pretend it was separate anymore. Tyler was the first to move, stepping out of the car slowly, irritation already sharpening his posture, his attention fixed on the man approaching like he was trying to play something he did not understand yet, something that did not fit into his version of control. "Is there a problem?" Tyler asked, his voice edged but contained, and I felt the question land in the space between them, waiting, testing, but the other man did not answer right away, did not rush, did not react. He just stopped a few feet away, hands relaxed at his sides, his presence alone enough to shift the balance of the moment without effort. He finally spoke, his voice low, even, carrying just enough to be heard without forcing it. "You should let go of her." And it was not loud, not aggressive, but something in it settled deeper than anything louder could have, something final, like the outcome had already been decided somewhere beyond this street. Tyler let out a short laugh, the kind that never reached his eyes, and I felt his tension spike beside me. "I do not think that concerns you," he replied, stepping slightly closer, positioning himself in a way that made it clear what he believed, what he claimed, and I felt that familiar pull again, that instinct to smooth things over, to step in, to stop whatever. This was before it turned into something worse, but I could not move, not this time, because something had already shifted too far. The other man did not react to the challenge, did not mirror the movement, did not escalate. He just watched Tyler with the same calm focus he had used on everything else, and when he spoke again, it was quieter, slower, each word placed with precision. "It does," he said, and for a second, the air seemed to thin, like the street itself was holding still around us. Tyler's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin in a way I recognized instantly, the kind that meant the moment was about to turn, and his hand reached for my wrist again, firmer this time, not enough to hurt, but enough to assert something, to make a point that did not need to be spoken, and that was when everything changed. I felt it before I saw it, that shift in the other man's expression, subtle but absolute, like a line had been crossed without warning, without negotiation, and for the first time, there was something different in his eyes, not louder, not more aggressive, just colder, more defined, like whatever restraint had been there before was no longer necessary. He took one step forward, just one, and it was enough to close the distance, enough to redraw the space between all of us in a way that made my breath catch. And when he spoke again, the words were soft, almost conversational, but they carried something heavier than anything else that had been said that night. "Let her go," he said, and there was no emphasis, no force, just certainty. And Tyler hesitated for half a second, just long enough for me to notice, just long enough to understand that something about this was different, something he could not immediately push through the way he always did. Slowly, almost reluctantly, his grip loosened, his hand falling away from my wrist like the moment had slipped out of his control without his permission, and the space between us widened in a way that felt unreal, like I was watching something I had never seen before. Tyler stepped back slightly, his expression shifting from irritation to something more cautious, more measured, and he looked between us once, twice, like he was recalculating, like he was trying to decide what this meant, what it changed, and then he let out a slow breath, forcing a tight smile that did not reach his eyes. "This is not over," he said quietly, not to me, not entirely. And then he turned, getting back into his car with controlled movements, the engine starting a second later, the sound fading as he pulled away without another word. The street fell silent again, but it was not the same silence as before, not tense, not fragile, something else entirely, something steadier, and I stood there for a second, trying to process what had just happened, trying to understand how something so simple could feel so impossible. I looked down at my wrist, the place where his hand had been, and then back up, meeting the other man's gaze for the first time without anything in between us, and my voice came out quieter than I expected. "Why did you do that?" I asked, because I did not understand, because nothing about this made sense in the world I knew. He studied me for a moment, his expression unchanged, his presence still steady in a way that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome. And when he answered, his voice was just as calm as before, just as certain. "Because you should not have to ask someone to let you go," he said, and something in my chest shifted at that, something small but undeniable, like a door I had not realized was closed had just opened a fraction of an inch, enough to let something new in. The silence after he spoke did not feel empty. It felt full, like something had settled into place that I had not realized was missing. And I stood there longer than I should have, my mind trying to catch up to a moment that had already moved past me, because nothing about what just happened fit into the life I knew. Nothing about it made sense in the rules I had learned to survive by. I should have thanked him, or walked away, or said something that made this smaller, more manageable, but instead I just stood there, staring at him like I was waiting for the rest of it, like I knew there was more and I did not know if I wanted to hear it. He did not move closer, did not try to fill the space between us, just watched me with that same steady focus, like he was giving me room to decide something, even if I did not understand what the choice was yet. "You should go inside," he said after a moment, his voice calm, almost gentle in a way that did not match anything else about him. and I glanced toward the building behind me, the familiar doorway that suddenly felt different, smaller somehow, like it belonged to a version of me that had already started to fade. "He will come back," I said quietly, not as a question, just a truth I had learned the hard way. Because people like Tyler did not walk away without returning, did not let go just because someone told them to. And the words felt heavier now, more real, because I was no longer the only one who understood what they meant. He did not look surprised, did not dismiss it, just nodded once, like he had already considered that possibility, like it had already been accounted for. "Not tonight," he said simply, and something in the certainty of it made my chest tighten. Not fear, not exactly, something else, something that felt dangerously close to relief. I hesitated, shifting my weight slightly, because part of me wanted to believe him, wanted to accept that statement without question, but another part, the part that had kept me careful for so long, resisted, searching for the catch, the cost, the thing that always came after. "You cannot control what he does," I said, the words coming out more defensive than I intended, because I needed to push back, needed to remind both of us where the boundaries were supposed to be, but his expression did not change, did not harden or soften, just remained steady in a way that made it hard to argue against. "No," he agreed quietly, and for a second, I thought that was it, that he would leave it there, that the moment would end the way most things did, unresolved and uncertain. But then he added, just as calmly, "But I can decide what happens if he tries." And the weight of that statement settled between us, not loud, not threatening, just absolute in a way that left no room for interpretation. I felt my breath catch. Again, because that was the difference, that was the thing I had not known how to name before. The reason everything about him felt so different from everything I had known. He did not react. He decided. And that kind of control was not something I had ever been on the receiving end of before, not like this, not without something being taken in return. "Why me?" I asked before I could stop myself, the question slipping out softer than I expected, because that was the part one could not understand, the part that did not fit into any logic I trusted. And for the first time, he paused, not long, just enough to consider the answer, like it mattered how he said it. His gaze held mine, steady, direct, and when he finally spoke, his voice was just as controlled as before, but there was something quieter underneath it, something I could not quite place. "Because you think being treated that way is something you have to accept," he said, and the words landed harder than anything else that night, because they were too close, too accurate, cutting past everything I had tried to keep hidden, and I felt that small shift again, that fragile crack in the walls I had built around myself, widening just enough to let something through. I looked away first, not because I wanted to, but because I could not hold that gaze any longer without giving something away, something I was not ready to face, and I nodded once, a small, almost automatic movement, before stepping back toward the building. "Good night," I said quietly, because I did not know what else to say, and for a second, I thought he might stop me, might say something else, but he did not, just inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement, letting me go without resistance, without pressure, and somehow that made it harder to walk away. I reached the door and paused, my hand resting on the handle, because I could feel it, that shift again, deeper now, more permanent, like something had changed in a way I could not reverse. And when I finally stepped inside, the hallway felt the same as always, dim lights, quiet air, familiar and unchanged. But I was not entirely, because for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was not just thinking about how to endure the next moment. I was thinking about what it might mean to not have to. I closed the door behind me and leaned against it for a second longer than necessary, my hand still on the handle like I needed to make sure it was real, like I needed something solid to hold on to after everything that had just shifted outside, and the quiet inside the apartment wrapped around me in a way that felt unfamiliar, not suffocating the way it usually did, just still, waiting, like even the walls were unsure what came next. I moved through the space slowly, setting my bag down, turning on the small lamp near the couch, the warm light filling the room in soft edges that made everything look the same as it always had. But it did not feel the same, not anymore, because something had changed in a way I could not ignore, something that had nothing to do with the furniture or the silence or the routine I had built to survive. I walked to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, my hands steady now, which felt strange after how they had been all day, and I stared at my reflection in the dark window above the sink, barely visible against the night outside, trying to recognize the person looking back at me, trying to understand why she felt different when nothing about her had actually changed. My phone buzzed suddenly against the counter, the sound sharp in the quiet, and my chest tightened instantly. That familiar reflex I could not unlearn, but when I looked at the screen, it was not Tyler's name, just a blank notification, nothing important, nothing urgent, and I exhaled slowly, realizing how automatic the fear had become, how deeply it had settled into me without permission. I picked up the phone anyway, scrolling through nothing, just to keep my hands busy, just to avoid thinking too much about what had happened. But the thoughts came anyway, replaying in fragments I could not piece together cleanly. The way Tyler had stepped back, the way his voice had changed, the way he had left without pushing further, and most of all, the way the other man had not needed to do anything more than stand there and decide. I set the phone down again, pressing my palms lightly against the counter as I closed my eyes for a moment, because that was the part that unsettled me the most. Not fear, not danger, something else entirely. The idea that someone could step into a moment like that and change its direction without raising their voice, without forcing anything, just by choosing a different outcome and making it real. I had spent so long believing that moments like that were fixed, that once something started, it would follow the same path every time, that the only control I had was how quietly I endured it. But tonight had not followed that pattern. Tonight had broken it in a way I did not know how to process. I moved back into the living room and sat down slowly, my eyes drifting toward the door like I expected something, or someone, to follow me inside. But it remained still, unchanged, and for the first time, the silence did not feel like something I had to fill or manage. It just existed, steady and neutral, like it was offering me space I had never had before. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. I could not tell, and eventually I stood again, walking to the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to look out onto the street below. And there, parked across from the building, was the same dark car, still, quiet, unmoving, like it had been placed there with intention. I did not know how long it had been there, did not know if it had followed me or waited for me, but something in my chest settled when I saw it. Not because I understood it, but because I did not have to, because for once, not understanding did not feel like a threat. I let the curtain fall back into place, stepping away from the window slowly, my mind quieter than it had been all day, because something had shifted that I could not undo, something that had changed the way I saw everything else. And as I turned off the light and moved toward my bedroom, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not bracing myself for what might happen next. I was wondering what I would choose if I no longer had to be afraid.